You're listening to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2. This season, we're exploring Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory. In Episode 3, we take a closer look at Populist Conservative Criminology and the emergence of Right Realism, a political and ideological shift that reshaped how crime and justice were approached in the late 20th century. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Great to have you with us. We're continuing our journey through Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory. And today, wow, we're hitting a really pivotal moment. It's about how thinking on crime shifted, especially in places like the US and the UK during the late 20th century. And this wasn't just, academics debating quietly. These were ideas that grabbed hold politically and really changed things on the ground, policy-wise.
That's absolutely right. The concepts we're digging into today, populist conservative criminology, and more specifically, right realism, they weren't just another academic theory. They represented a really deliberate political and ideological pushback. They aimed to challenge what had become the dominant ways of thinking about crime at the time. And in some ways, actually, they were looking back, trying to revive older ideas about why people commit crime and how society should respond.
Okay, so for this deep dive, our mission is pretty clear. We want to unpack the main ideas of this perspective. We need to see where it came from, the whole historical backdrop, the politics, the social climate. We'll look at who the key players were, how they explained crime, what kinds of policies they pushed for, and what actually happened because of them. And crucially, we have to examine the major criticisms that came up, all based strictly on our source material from Hopkins Burke.
Yeah, and what's really striking, looking at the source, is just how closely these criminological ideas got tangled up with a specific political movement rising at the time. It really drives home the point that theories about crime are almost never completely separate from wider social values or political ambitions.
Okay, let's start there then. Let's set that stage. What was going on historically, say, in the 70s and 80s, that kind of created the space for this perspective to really take off?
Well, looking back, the source points out that for a good chunk of the 20th century, the main way people thought about crime has shifted away from something called the rational actor model. That's the older idea, from classical criminology, that people are rational, they weigh the pros and cons, and choose to commit crime if the benefits seem to outweigh the risks.
Right, this sort of cost-benefit analysis idea.
Exactly. But that faded a bit. Instead, what dominated was the predestined actor model.
And that model says crime isn't so much a free choice, but more a result of things pushing people into it, like psychological problems, maybe biology, or importantly, tough social or economic situations.
Precisely. So under that predestined model, the focus for criminologists and policymakers was different. It was about finding those root causes, biological, psychological, sociological, whatever they were thought to be, and then trying to fix them. Treatment, rehabilitation, maybe even tackling the bigger societal problems that were seen as breeding grounds for crime. Punishment in that view was less about simple payback or deterrence and more about trying to reform the person or manage someone seen as kind of doomed to offend.
Okay, but then you're saying in the 70s and 80s, the political winds shifted and that older rational choice idea suddenly came roaring back.
That's exactly what the source describes. It pinpoints the rise of the new political right, sometimes called populist conservatives or neoconservatives. This movement gained serious political power, and with it came this resurgence of the idea that people are fundamentally rational actors, and crime is basically a choice they make when the circumstances seem right for it.
And we saw this directly in politics, right? Like Margaret Thatcher in the UK, elected in '79. The source says she made crime a big campaign issue, successfully tapping into that public mood.
Absolutely. Crime became a really powerful political tool. And it wasn't just the UK. In the US, you had presidents like Richard Nixon back in the 70s already running on a get tough platform, reacting to rising crime and social unrest. That really set the stage for later figures like Ronald Reagan in the 80s, who, as the source notes, appointed key advisors like James Q. Wilson, someone who explicitly championed this new conservative thinking on crime.
So this wasn't just abstract theory, it was influencing who got elected and who was advising presidents. What were the broader goals of this new right movement beyond just tackling crime?
Well, the source suggests it was part of a much wider cultural and moral project. They launched what's called a vigorous moral campaign against various forms of deviance. Thatcher, for instance, explicitly talked about wanting to reestablish Victorian values.
Victorian values, that phrase alone really signals a pushback, doesn't it? A desire to return to what was seen as a time of stronger morals, more order, traditional structures.
Definitely. And a key target for them was what they called the permissive society. that they felt emerged in the 1960s. They saw that era as undermining social order, traditional morality. And crucially, they believed this permissiveness had been kind of unable, even legitimized, by what they termed soft social science.
So wait, they weren't just criticizing the cultural shifts themselves, they were actually blaming the academics and social scientists at the time for, like, giving those shifts intellectual cover.
That's exactly the argument presented. They saw certain trends in sociology and criminology as being too focused on external causes, too understanding maybe, and therefore weakening social controls. Now, this new right agenda wasn't about totally rejecting modernity. They wanted to protect and expand economic and technological progress. But alongside that, they aimed to launch, and the source uses this phrase, a comprehensive assault on the cultural and ethical parts of modern society they saw as damaging.
A comprehensive assault on culture and ethics. That sounds pretty intense, like a real battle for society's direction.
It was framed that way, yes. They felt that modernist culture, with its focus on subjective values, individual self-expression, questioning traditions, was actively hurting the motivational requirements needed for, say, an efficient economy or a well-run state. The source mentions Habermas, noting this view led to perceiving individuals as less willing to strive for traditional goals and, more importantly, even less prepared to obey authority.
Ah, okay. So the critique wasn't just moral outrage. It connected directly to concerns about economic productivity and political stability. If people were too busy finding themselves and not following the rules, that was seen as bad for business and bad for government.
Precisely. So the response from these populist conservatives was a call to bring back tradition, reinforce the values of the state, the schools, the family, and demand, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly, a more unquestioning acceptance of authority.
And how did this big picture cultural and political critique play out specifically within criminology?
Well, in crime policy, this perceived liberal indulgence they were attacking was seen as perfectly captured by the dominant theories. You had the predestined actor model, focusing on causes, pushing for treatment and rehab over punishment. And then gaining ground on the left was the victimized actor model, which often pointed to social inequality as the root of crime, and sometimes advocated for policies of understanding, maybe even forgiveness or non-intervention.
So the new right saw both of these approaches as fundamentally flawed, as part of the problem.
Exactly. And some right-wing intellectuals took it even further. The source says they argued that progressive theorizing had itself provided a basis for the acceleration of the permissive syndromes in question. Wow, that's a strong claim. Not just that the theories were wrong, but that they were actively making things worse by encouraging the breakdown of order. Yes, they were seen as part of this corrosive influence. Rising crime and disorder were blamed on two things. One, the weakening of traditional authorities, family, school, church. And two, maybe even more significantly, the corrosive influence of the surrounding culture.
The culture being one that, in their view, stressed individual rights over duties and self-expression over self-discipline.
That's the argument highlighted, drawing on Xanatakis. The idea that focusing on rights instead of responsibilities, celebrating self-expression that could slide into self-indulgence rather than cultivating self-control, created this spiraling, demoralizing culture. And the conclusion they reached was stark. In that kind of culture, crime and violence were bound to rise.
So the solution, then, couldn't just be about catching criminals. It had to address this perceived moral and cultural decay.
Right. The call was to confront both the real problems of crime and the sociological apologies they believed excused it. It meant tackling crime head-on while also challenging the theories seen as enabling it. The answer had to be a forceful reassertion of the virtue and necessity of authority, order, and discipline, echoing thinkers like Struton mentioned in the text.
And this ideological position quickly translated into concrete policy changes.
It certainly did. The source calls it a clear assault on the liberal and radical left trends, not just broadly in social policy, but very specifically in crime and justice policy. It was a conscious effort to roll back approaches seen as too lenient, too focused on welfare or rehabilitation.
Was there any specific research finding that gave them sort of empirical firepower for this push away from rehabilitation?
Yes. There was a very influential paper by Robert Martinson in 1974. It gained a lot of traction because it claimed to show that, based on his review of studies, existing prison rehabilitation programs essentially do not work.
Nothing works, as it became known. That would have been a huge blow to policies based on fixing offenders.
A massive blow. It provided strong support for arguments against rehabilitation and undermined the whole rationale for welfare-type services in the justice system, like probation, which are fundamentally based on the idea of supervised change.
Okay, so if rehabilitation is off the table, what's the alternative they pushed for?
The alternative they enthusiastically embraced was the reintroduction of the idea of retributive punishment. The viewpoint became much simpler, much more direct. Serious crimes are simply evil, and the main job of the justice system should be to protect society from dangerous people by punishing the offender.
So the focus shifts dramatically. It's not about trying to change the offender anymore. It's about punishing the act and protecting the public.
That's the core idea. From this populist conservative angle, punishment isn't therapy. It's about making sure the penalty fits the crime, reflecting society's moral condemnation and making sure it's actually carried out. The stated purpose was to reinforce social values by showing clear consequences for breaking them. This links right back to treating the offender not as someone needing help, but as someone who violated social morality through a conscious choice and therefore deserved punishment. It's described as a modern take on the rational actor model, but with a definite retributive edge.
So just to really nail this down, this wasn't just about wanting lower crime rates out of pragmatism. It was deeply tied into a whole cultural and political philosophy. Crime was seen as proof that society was losing its way, losing respect for authority, losing self-control. And the fix had to be just as fundamental. Restore authority, restore moral clarity, primarily through certain punishment that reinforces the rules.
That's precisely how the source presents the argument. Crime was the symptom. The disease was seen as a weakening of moral fiber and obedience. The prescribed cure was a strong dose of authority and punishment to shore up social values and deter further wrongdoing.
That really sets the scene for specific thinkers who champion this, like James Q. Wilson, and the development of right realism as a distinct approach.
Absolutely. James Q. Wilson is definitely presented as the key figure here, especially in the U.S. His big book, Thinking About Crime, came out in 1975, right when crime rates were high and public anxiety was growing, which, made people receptive to his ideas. Interestingly, the source does mention that in his earlier work, Wilson apparently shows some skepticism towards both traditional conservative and left-wing approaches, suggesting maybe a more independent start.
But his views seemed to crystallize or get tougher later on, particularly when he gained political influence.
The source suggests his position did harden, taking on more of that retributive element we see in later right realism. This was especially notable after he became a special advisor on crime to President Reagan in the 1980s. That position obviously gave him a direct channel to influence actual policy.
So what was Wilson's basic take on crime itself? Did he think it was solvable in the traditional sense?
Well, he actually accepted some points often made by liberals. For instance, he acknowledged that just throwing more police patrols out there or automatically making all sentences longer or shuffling government departments around often didn't seem to make much difference to the overall crime rate. However, he was completely scornful of any arguments that tried to downplay crime as a real, serious problem affecting ordinary people's lives.
He wasn't buying into debates about whether crime stats were flawed or if certain acts should even be illegal. For him, it was just real and bad.
Exactly. The core message of right realism, driven by Wilson and summarized in our source, is very direct. Crime is quite simply an evil that requires a concerted and rigorous response. It's positioned as a moral issue requiring firm action, not a complex social phenomenon needing endless analysis or therapeutic intervention.
And this perspective led him to develop arguably his most famous contribution, the broken windows theory about policing.
Yes, broken windows, developed with George Kelling in articles from 1982 and 1989, proposed a really different role for the police. They argued police are most effective, not primarily as crime fighters focused on solving major felonies after they happen, but as agents whose main job is to maintain social order in public spaces.
Maintaining social order, how does that work in practice compared to just fighting crime?
Kelling summed it up later, saying, "You ignore minor offenses at great cost." The central idea is that visible signs of disorder, things like litter, graffiti, vacant buildings with broken windows if they're ignored, send a signal. They suggest that social control is weak, that nobody cares about the area. This, they argued, creates fear among residents and, critically, acts as a precursor to serious crime.
Okay. So the theory is, let the small stuff slide, and it creates an atmosphere where people feel unsafe, and it also tells potential criminals, hey, the rules don't really apply here, which makes them bolder.
That's the proposed mechanism. Conversely, they argued, if police and the community actively address these minor signs of disorder, it strengthens community control. People feel safer, they use public spaces more, neighbors look out for each other more, and this environment encourages law-abiding behavior and discourages crime.
So the police role shifts quite dramatically under this model.
It does. Their main job becomes creating an environment where serious crime struggles to get a foothold because the conditions aren't right for it. The focus moves away from just reacting to major crimes and towards proactively regulating street life and tackling what they called incivilities.
Incivilities,
Yeah.
what kind of things fall into that category?
The source gives examples like public prostitution, aggressive begging, gang fights in the street, public drunkenness, generally disorderly conduct. These might not be major felonies, but right realists saw controlling them as absolutely crucial.
Because even if one instance isn't that bad, a lot of it together signals that things are out of control.
Exactly. The source notes these things in aggregate damage community life and safety, so they need controlling. This broken windows idea really gets at that core belief. Visible decay, left unchecked, breeds fear and encourages worse behavior. It's presented as this kind of negative spiral. Minor problems lead to major ones if you don't intervene early.
So policing becomes less about investigation after the fact and much more about proactive patrolling and enforcing standards of public behavior.
That's a central part of it, yes. Actively managing those visible signs of disorder that they believed undermined social control and paved the way for serious crime.
Now, Wilson was clearly skeptical about treating crime away through rehabilitation, based on the predestined actor idea. But did right realists just ignore the question of why some people might be more likely to offend than others? Did they offer any explanation at all?
They didn't ignore it completely, no. Even though they distrusted the policy conclusions drawn from the predestined actor model, Wilson and Richard Herrnstein did try to formulate an explanation for individual differences. In 1985, they proposed what the source calls a biosocial explanation.
Biosocial, so mixing biology and social factors.
That's the idea. They argued that a person's tendency towards crime isn't fixed. It depends on how well they've internalized self-control. And that self-control, they said, is developed or fails to develop based on how much society invests in teaching it through things like family, peers, school, work. But importantly, they also brought in the idea that genetic and biological traits could play a role, though they added these weren't necessarily unchangeable.
Okay, so it's a kind of nature and nurture mix, but specifically focused on whether someone develops effective self-control.
Yes, that's the crux of it. And the source notes this perspective was used to criticize certain family structures, particularly the single-parent variant, arguing they were often less effective at socializing children properly. They also suggested learning ability itself is influenced by both innate constitution and social inputs. So the conclusion was, biology might identify who's at risk, but socialization, or its failure, determines if that risk actually turns into criminal behavior.
That sounds relatively complex, actually, compared to just saying it's a rational choice. But then the source says Wilson didn't really carry this biosocial idea through into his policy recommendations. Why not?
Yeah, this is really key to understanding, right, realism's practical focus. While Wilson includes these biosocial ideas in his analysis, he does not pursue this line of reasoning for policy. The source explains it pragmatically. You can't really change someone's biology through policy, at least not yet. And while populist conservatives did want to influence things like family structure and socialization, changing those things quickly through policy is incredibly difficult, maybe impossible.
So they identified these deeper potential factors, but decided they weren't useful targets for immediate, practical crime reduction policies.
Exactly. They acknowledged the complexity, but then pivoted to what they saw as doable. The main goal for policy became reducing crime by changing the immediate calculation potential offenders make, making an honest life seem relatively more attractive, or, more commonly, making crime seem much riskier and less rewarding. They recognized complex roots, but focused policy on tweaking that immediate risk-reward calculation.
That brings us right back to the rational actor model and also connects to how they viewed crime victims.
Yes, right. Realism really emphasized findings from victim surveys. And what those surveys consistently showed, and what right realists highlighted, was that crime hits the poor, the disadvantaged, those least able to protect themselves, the hardest.
Which, again, you might think sounds like an argument about social inequality.
You might, but the source is very clear. They absolutely deny the idea, common, more radical, or conflict theories, that crime is mainly about an oppressed class fighting back against an unfair system. Right. Realists stress that overwhelmingly, both the people committing predatory crimes like robbery and assault and their victims tend to come from the same communities, often disadvantaged ones.
So they're arguing it's not the poor stealing from the rich, it's often poor people preying on other poor people within their own neighborhoods?
That's the core argument, and it fits perfectly with their adoption of utilitarian explanation for crime. Wilson, in his book, notes how individualistic most offending is. He uses that classic utilitarian logic. People act based on weighing costs and benefits. He gives a really telling example. If the supply and value of legitimate opportunities, i.e. jobs, was declining at the very time that the cost of illegitimate opportunities, i.e. fines and jail terms, was also declining, a rational teenager might well have concluded that it made more sense to steal cars than to wash them.
That example makes the cost-benefit idea very concrete. If legitimate work pays badly or isn't available, and the chances of getting caught and punished for crime are low, crime starts looking like the logical choice.
Exactly. Now, logically, that utilitarian view could lead to two policy approaches. Increase the rewards for not committing crime, better jobs, opportunities, the carrot, and increase the costs of committing crime, more certain punishment, the stick. However, the source points out that Wilson and Right Realism in general heavily focused on the second part, increasing the costs. The overall populist conservative strategy is described as placing far more emphasis on the stick than the carrot.
So while maybe nodding to the carrot of opportunity, the real policy energy went into strengthening the stick of punishment. How did their ideas about applying punishment differ from just being generally tough on crime?
This is an important nuance. Right realism wasn't just about demanding harsher sentences across the board. Wilson, for example, acknowledged that the U.S. already locked up a huge number of people for very long times, often longer than countries with lower crime rates, without necessarily seeing better results. So instead of just focusing on severity, Wilson really stressed the certainty of punishment.
So it's less about how long you might go away for and more about how likely it is you'll face some consequence if you commit a crime.
That's the central idea. They argue that just having more police doesn't work if the courts and corrections systems are inconsistent. An arrest only matters if it leads reliably to conviction and punishment. The source gives some striking stats. The chance of going to prison for a robbery was apparently 4 times higher in the UK than California and 6 times higher in Japan, highlighting big differences in certainty.
That really shows how different systems deliver consequences or fail to.
And Wilson and Herrnstein gave a psychological reason for this focus on certainty in their 1985 work. They argued basically that consequences gradually lose their ability to control behavior in proportion to how delayed or improbable they are. Felsen used the famous hot stove analogy to make this point.
Right, the hot stove. How does that go again?
It's simple but effective. Touch a real hot stove, you get burned immediately. Certainly, maybe not severely, but you'll learn instantly. Don't do that. Now imagine an imaginary stove that only burns you, say, once every few hundred times you touch it, and the pain doesn't even start for months. Common sense tells you the imaginary stove's delayed, uncertain punishment is way less effective. The point is, delay and uncertainty kill the deterrent effect, no matter how harsh the theoretical punishment is.
So the solution for them wasn't just threatening big punishments, but making the whole system, police, courts, corrections, work together consistently to deliver some consequence reliably.
Precisely. They advocated for things like catching more offenders, better policing, improving the consistency of the whole justice system, and tackling problems like poor police-community relations in high-crime areas, because mistrust hinders the flow of information needed to solve crimes and secure convictions.
Interestingly, they also seemed critical of the really long sentences common in the U.S. system. That seems counterintuitive for a tough approach.
It does at first glance. The source notes the U.S. paradox. Longer potential sentences, but fewer convictions for predatory crime compared to some other countries. Wilson and Herrnstein actually argued against undue severity. Why? 2 reasons given. First, maybe super long sentences feel unfair to the prisoner, breeding resentment and revenge later. Second, and more aligned with their certainty argument, judges might be less willing to actually impose extremely long sentences consistently, or they lead to more plea bargains for lesser terms, which undermines that crucial principle of certainty.
So ironically, demanding extremely severe sentences could actually make punishment less certain in practice.
That's the logic presented. And when it came to sentencing itself, they really disliked what they saw as the system's irrationality, often reflecting judges' doubts about prison as a deterrent. They pointed to low rates of re-imprisonment for repeat offenders as evidence of this inconsistency.
And what was their fix for this perceived inconsistency?
They pushed for fixed-term sentences for specific crimes, meaning the sentence length would be set by law for that offense, and it wouldn't vary based on the offender's age, background, or, importantly, their perceived potential for rehabilitation.
Fixed terms, taking away judicial discretion based on individual circumstances.
That was the proposal. The rationale was, if deterrence is a goal, potential offenders need to know in advance what the definite penalty is. They argued that letting sentences vary based on things like perceived risk of reoffending created a moral dilemma. They suggested it often led to, say, younger, poorer offenders from unstable backgrounds getting longer sentences than older middle-class offenders for the same crime, simply because judges made different assumptions about who was more likely to change.
That's a really interesting point about how discretion, even well-intentioned, could lead to unequal outcomes based on background.
It highlights how they saw focusing purely on the offense and applying a fixed, certain punishment as potentially more equitable than individualized sentencing. But while arguing for certainty over mere severity, right, realists were very strong advocates for using imprisonment as a tool of incapacitation.
Incapacitation, the simple idea that if someone's locked up, they physically can't be out committing crimes against the public.
Exactly that. They stress the point that a relatively small number of repeat offenders, recidivists, are responsible for a large proportion of known crime. So the logic follows. If offenders in certain high-risk categories are certain to be incarcerated when caught, even if it's for shorter periods, the overall crime rate must go down, just because those active offenders are taken out of circulation.
And they didn't necessarily mean just traditional prison for this.
The source suggests incapacitation could take other forms, maybe overnight or weekend incarceration, as long as it was applied certainly and rigorously to the target groups. This whole package emphasizing deterrence through certainty, fixed sentencing, and incapacitation is described as a neoclassical approach, updating older ideas for modern policy.
And James Q. Wilson himself summed up this whole worldview pretty starkly in that famous quote from Thinking About Crime.
Yes, that quote really encapsulates it. Wicked people exist. Nothing avails except to keep them apart from innocent people. And many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their opportunities, ponder our reaction to wickedness as a cue to what they might profitably do.
Wicked people exist. That phrase really cuts through any nuance about circumstances or reform, doesn't it? It firmly locates the problem in the individual either inherently bad, wicked, or just coldly calculating.
It absolutely captures that core philosophy. Identify the wicked and separate them. Deter the calculating through clear consequences. It leaves very little space for considering social context or the possibility of change, focusing almost entirely on control and deterrence.
Following that theme of control, how did right realism think about social control more broadly, beyond just the formal justice system?
They put a lot of weight on actively upholding public order and public morality as vital parts of crime control. This put them directly at odds with liberal calls to decriminalize or legalize things often seen as victimless or minor street offenses like prostitution or recreational drug use. Right realists argued for more, not less, control over these activities.
So behaviors others might see as private matters or low priority, right? Realists viewed it as essential battlegrounds for maintaining public standards.
Precisely. Take their approach to drugs. Wilson argued the focus shouldn't be so much on big dealers or treating addicts who are beyond help, but rather on these small-time users identified as attacking the fiber of the community.
Wow, framing casual users as attacking the fiber of the community really changes the focus, doesn't it?
It shifts it from an individual problem or a major criminal enterprise issue to a matter of public order and moral contagion at the street level. And this ties right back into Wilson and Kelling's broken windows. They argued police should intervene against behaviors not even strictly criminal, things they saw as indicators of social decline.
These are those incivilities again.
Yes, the source lists things like unsecured empty properties, noisy kids hanging out, groups of youths on street corners, litter, noise, intimidation basically, anything that contributes to a feeling of disorder.
And why go after such seemingly small things?
Because, in their view, these weren't just annoyances. They were signals that formal and informal social controls were breaking down. Tolerating these incivilities was seen as creating the welcoming preconditions for serious crime to move in. So cracking down on disorder was framed as preventative medicine for serious crime.
And a really crucial aspect of right realism, highlighted in the source, is that this intense focus on controlling individual behavior didn't come with calls for fixing society's bigger problems.
Absolutely not. The source is explicit, right? Realists make no demands for changes in the structural conditions in society.
So, no calls to reduce poverty, improve schools, tackle discrimination, things like that.
That's not presented as part of their policy agenda. The demands are all focused on controlling individual behavior. The argument they made was that these low-level incivilities and disorder are what most interfere with people's daily enjoyment of life, especially for poor people living in affected areas.
So they're essentially arguing that policing litter or teenage loitering is, in a way, more important or at least more practical than trying to fix poverty, because those visible signs of disorder are what directly impact residents' quality of life and sense of safety, and they are things the police can theoretically control.
That's the rationale presented in the source for their focus. It keeps the attention firmly on managing individual conduct and visible disorder at the street level, rather than engaging with deeper, structural, social, and economic issues.
This focus on controlling incivilities and individual behavior seems like it would directly influence how police resources are used and who gets targeted.
It definitely did. The strategy outlined was quite pragmatic in its own way. They argued interventions should focus on areas seen as being at high risk of becoming high crime zones, or those just starting to decline, the tipping point areas. The idea was to nip the problem in the bud, restore order before it got out of hand.
Okay, but what about the neighborhoods where crime and disorder were already deeply rooted, the really tough areas?
According to the strategy described in the source, those areas where crime was already endemic were not considered the best places to invest resources aimed at restoring social order. The priority was areas where behavior was thought changeable, where order could plausibly be restored. In the really problematic neighborhoods, the approach shifted to what the source calls a more comprehensive assault on criminality itself.
So it's almost like writing off the worst areas in terms of social order policing and instead just focusing purely on arresting criminals there, a kind of containment strategy.
Yeah, that seems to be the implication.
Yeah.
In those areas, the police role advocated was primarily detecting and prosecuting offenders, with a particularly aggressive response reserved for repeat offenders.
And that specific focus on repeat offenders, that directly spawned a very famous and controversial policy, right?
It certainly did. That emphasis on incapacitating repeat offenders was a major driving force behind 3 strikes and you're out laws, especially in the U.S. Under these laws, a third felony conviction, even if the third offense itself was relatively minor, could trigger a mandatory, extremely long prison sentence, like 25 years to life.
25 to life for potentially a minor third felony.
The statistics cited from 2002 really show the impact. At that time, 6,700 people were serving 25 to life under third strike. Over half of them, more than 3,350, were nonviolent offenders. And stunningly, 350 people were doing 25 to life specifically for petty theft as their third strike.
Petty theft leading to a potential life sentence, that really hammers home the focus on incapacitation over proportionality for the actual offense.
It really does. And the source also pointed out the racial disparities. 44% of those serving third strike sentences then were Black, 26% Latino. It shows how this focus on certainty and incapacitation, even for lesser crimes, had massive disproportionate consequences for certain groups.
Okay, let's try to summarize realism then. It's essentially a modern comeback for the idea that crime is a rational choice.
Fundamentally, yes. It's seen as a contemporary revival of that rational actor model. The core belief is that crime isn't mainly caused by social factors or psychological issues, but results from an individual choice made by weighing opportunities, risks, and rewards.
And so the way to stop crime is through practical steps that change that calculation for the individual.
Exactly. Make crime less attractive. How? Reduce opportunities. Increase the real and perceived chance of getting caught through visible policing, especially of disorder, and most crucially, make punishment definite and certain when someone is caught.
Not just a severe threat, but a certain one, delivered quickly.
That's the key principle emphasized. The punishment needs to be perceived as severe, certain, and swift. And within that, prison is seen as highly effective, both for physically stopping offenders, incapacitation, and for scaring potential offenders straight through deterrence.
And this way of thinking had a huge, undeniable impact, especially on policy in the U.S.
The numbers certainly suggest so. The source mentioned the U.S. prison population hitting 2 million in 2002, the world's largest, proportionally too, with 1 in every 142 people incarcerated.
That figure is just mind-boggling. It points to a massive shift in how the justice system operated.
And as we saw with 3 strikes, it wasn't evenly spread. The source cited a U.S. Justice Department estimate showing huge racial disparity. 12% of black men in their 20s, early 30s in prison versus 1.6% of white men the same age. That near doubling of the U.S. prison population from 1990 is largely attributed to these get-tough sentencing policies influenced by right realist ideas, longer sentences, especially for drugs, mandatory minimums, things like that.
The link between the theory and the reality of mass incarceration and its disparities seems pretty direct based on that.
That's what the source material indicates. And while the U.S. was the most extreme example, the trend wasn't unique. England and Wales also saw significant prison population growth during that period, reflecting similar policy currents.
And this emphasis on retribution even extended to the ultimate punishment, the death penalty.
Yes, the source points to the reintroduction and increased use of capital punishment in the U.S. during this era as embodying that retributive impulse, fitting the political climate where right realism flourished. It is ironic, though, as the source notes, because early rational actor thinkers like Beccaria actually opposed the death penalty as uncivilized, even while focusing on deterrence.
So a modern version of the rational actor model actually went against one of the key humanitarian positions of its founder.
On that specific point, yes. However, the source suggests another aspect was consistent with older rational actor thinking, the tendency to treat even children as rational actors, capable of calculation and deserving of severe punishment. It mentions a disturbing Amnesty International finding from 2002. Over the previous decade, 2/3 of all known executions of juvenile offenders worldwide happened in the USA.
That's a chilling statistic, applying that rational choice and punishment logic even to minors.
It is, and the source adds that, at the time, the U.S. and Somalia were the only 2 UN members not to have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which bans executing minors.
Okay, wow. That's been an incredibly detailed exploration of populist conservative criminology and right realism. We've traced its roots, met key figures like Wilson, grasped its core ideas, rational choice, order maintenance, the biosocial nod is mostly ignored for policy, and the huge emphasis on certainty, punishment, and incapacitation that led to things like 3 strikes and skyrocketing prison numbers. But like any major theory, it definitely didn't escape criticism.
Not at all. After laying out the key propositions of right realism,
Yeah.
Crime as individual tendency, causes are a distraction, punishment works, rehab doesn't, crime fear are real, be pragmatic, crime violates morality, assert authority. The source dedicates a lot of space to detailing the major critiques. It lists 7 significant ones.
Right, let's get into those. What's the first major objection raised?
The first big one is about focus. Critics argue, right, realism concentrates almost entirely on street crime and visible social order, virtually ignoring other massive types of crime, specifically white-collar and corporate crime.
So crime committed by powerful people or organizations, not just individuals on the street.
Exactly. The argument, citing scholars like Conklin and Kroll, is that these corporate crimes are often so costly to the economy, causing far greater financial harm, and sometimes even more injury or death than typical street crime. While right realism acknowledges street crime feels more immediate and drives the fear of crime, which is a real phenomena, the criticism is that this narrow focus creates a huge blind spot.
So while getting mugged is terrifying, things like massive financial fraud, environmental pollution, selling unsafe products, these might cause vastly more damage overall, but are largely ignored by this perspective.
That's exactly the criticism presented. The source gives examples like pension mis-selling ruining lives, dangerous pharmaceuticals sold overseas, toxic dumping things with considerable aggregate impact that fall outside the right realist frame.
Okay, what's criticism number 2?
The second hits their explanation for crime. It accuses right realism of basically ignoring all the big social, economic, and structural factors: poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, social exclusion. Instead, it focuses almost exclusively on individual failings: bad behavioral conditioning, poor socialization, lack of self-control.
So they might mention things like family breakdown, but they don't connect it to the wider social conditions that might cause family breakdown or push people towards crime in the first place.
Exactly. And the source notes that the core link proposed by Broken Windows, that minor disorder directly causes serious crime, has been difficult to prove empirically. Research cited, like Matthew's work in the UK, apparently found that deeper social problems like poverty and lack of services were far more significant drivers of urban decline than just visible incivilities.
So the evidence pointed more towards the underlying social issues than the surface-level disorder that Right Realists wanted to police.
That's the interpretation offered regarding that research. The third criticism is about the policy implications of their targeting strategy, the idea of focusing resources on areas just starting to decline, and essentially not investing order maintenance efforts in areas already deemed endemic with crime.
We talked about that triage approach, fix the fixable, contain the rest.
Right. And the criticism is harsh. It argues that people living in those endemic areas are effectively abandoned by the order maintenance side of policing. But then, when they do break the law, they face the full force of the assault on criminality, vigorous policing, harsh punishment. So they're left vulnerable to crime in their daily lives, and then hit hard by the justice system when they transgress, making things even worse for them.
It sounds like a real double bind, unprotected as potential victims,
Wow.
heavily punished as offenders.
And the source adds that this perspective is seen as blaming the victims, essentially holding residents responsible for their situation, for failing to socialize their kids properly, failing to use appropriate control, often implying physical punishment. It connects back to blaming individual and family failures, not systemic issues.
The fourth criticism targets the policing methods themselves.
Yes. It argues that policing minor public order stuff like begging or vagrancy, the incivilities, often involves police intervening on often dubious legality. The lines aren't always clear, giving police a lot of discretion. And more fundamentally, it's seen as simply unfair because it inevitably targets specific disadvantaged groups like homeless people just for being visibly poor or different.
So the focus on incivilities becomes a tool for policing poverty and marginalization.
That's the essence of the critique unfair targeting based on status and behavior rather than serious harm. The fifth criticism concerns police effectiveness and accountability. Some argue, like Kinsey, Leah, and Young, that crime clearance rates solving actual reported crimes are the best, maybe the only, real measure of police performance in their core crime-fighting role.
And if police shift focus to maintaining order and dealing with incivilities, what happens to those clearance rates?
The argument is that the order maintenance model makes it harder to measure if police are actually succeeding at solving crimes. Clearance rates might drop, but the justification would be they're busy doing other things.
So it muddies the waters on evaluating police effectiveness?
Yes, and potentially makes them less accountable for their primary crime-solving job. Plus, the source adds a deeper concern from Smith. Giving police this broad, flexible mandate to control vaguely defined incivilities makes ensuring their accountability and professionalism very difficult. Less clear legal boundaries could lead to inconsistent enforcement or abuse of power.
That definitely raises civil liberties questions. What's the sixth criticism?
The sixth points to the social consequences of the whole framework. It argues that this realist revival of the rational actor model crime as a choice made by people lacking moral values leads directly to the targeting and demonization of whole groups of people.
Which groups tend to get demonized under this lens?
The source gives examples like New Age travelers, drug users, especially those small-time users, and groups of young men perceived as threatening or marauding. The argument is that this targeting happens through an intrusive and punitive law and order state response, where these groups are specifically marked out as worthy of severe and vindictive punishment, according to Hogg and Brown.
So the theory itself provides a kind of justification for cracking down hard on specific populations who are seen as embodying disorder or a lack of traditional values.
That's the argument, that the framework fuels moral panics and justifies punitive responses against already marginalized groups. And finally, the seventh criticism gets right down to what some see as the fundamental motivation, a specific political and economic agenda underlying
Right.
realism.
Tell us about that one. What's the alleged agenda?
This critique points to figures like Ernest van den Haag, described as an early right realist who was apparently quite open about the political dimension and dismissive of social concerns. He's presented as a staunch defender of capitalism's necessity.
How did he link defending capitalism to crime theory?
His logic, as described, was that capitalism inevitably creates winners and losers. If you accept that, he argued, then you must accept that the winners need to enjoy their success without having it illegally taken by the losers.
So protecting the property and wealth of the successful becomes essential for the whole system to work.
Exactly. For capitalism to function, those who create wealth must be protected from crime. The source expands this, saying the protection extends to all the significantly employed core members of society, people with jobs, opportunities, rewards. This core group which provides the votes for these policies, needs protection from criminals and from the socially excluded underclass.
Wow. That really frames right realism not just as a theory about crime, but as an ideological project designed to protect a specific social and economic order, and the people who benefit most from it, from those seen as threats or failures within that system.
It explicitly links the criminological ideas to a defense of capitalism and the perceived need to control populations seen as destabilizing or threatening to the established order and its core beneficiaries.
That provides a really critical lens. It's been fascinating and frankly quite sobering to trace the rise and impact of this school of thought for anyone listening who wants to go even deeper into the history. The core texts, the critiques, the source material from Hopkins Burke does suggest further reading.
Yes, it lists authors like Dale, Morgan, and Scruton for the background context, Wilson, Kelling, and Herrnstein for the core realist texts themselves, and then names like Kinsey, Leah, Young, Matthews, Hogg, and Brown for exploring the criticisms in more detail. Definitely good resources if you want to do your own deep dive.
So we've covered a lot of ground today on populist conservative criminology and right realism. We saw how it emerged from a specific political moment, how it shifted the conversation away from social causes and rehabilitation towards individual choice, order, certainty of punishment, and incapacitation.
And the real-world consequences were huge policies like 3 strikes, the massive growth in prisons, particularly in the U.S., with all the related disparities. Understanding this perspective, even with all the heavy criticisms, is really vital because these ideas shaped policies that still impact millions, often the most vulnerable among us.
Absolutely. It really did change the game in criminal justice. Which leaves us with a final question for you, the listener, to think about after all this. Considering everything we've discussed, the arguments of right realism, its outcomes, the criticisms, what do you think is the most effective way forward for creating a society that's both safe and just? Is it primarily about emphasizing individual responsibility and ensuring punishment is certain, as right realism argues? Or is it more crucial to tackle those broader social, economic, and cultural conditions that critics point to as the real drivers of crime? Or perhaps is there some kind of complex balance needed, and how could we find it without falling into the traps that the critics have highlighted?
It's a huge question, really, about how we understand crime and structure society. And this deep dive has certainly given us one very influential, highly contested way of thinking about it.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into a really crucial chapter in criminological thought and policy. We really appreciate you spending your time with us, and we look forward to our next exploration from Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory.